I knew my wife was cheating before she even looked up. She was sitting in our usual booth at Millie's Diner, the place we had breakfast every Sunday for the last 10 years. But today, she wasn't alone. Jake Henderson sat across from her, leaning in close, a cocky smirk on his face. And Becky? She was laughing at something he said, her fingers lightly grazing his wrist on the table. She never even noticed me walk in. The diner had every pair of eyes flicked to me the second I stepped through the door. Millie, who had known me since I was a kid, wouldn't meet my gaze. Old man Grayson had paused mid-bite, his fork hovering in the air. Even the college kid behind the counter stopped wiping down the coffee machine, watching me like a deer caught in headlights. The air shifted. The only two people in the whole damn building who hadn't noticed? My wife. And the man she was screwing behind my back. I didn't make a scene. Not yet. Instead, I walked to the counter, leaned in, and said too quietly, Millie. She tensed. Wiped her hands on her apron. Morning, Mark. I kept my voice even. How long? She flinched. And that told me everything. I turned back to the booth, just as Becky finally looked up and saw me standing there. Her expression froze just for a fraction of a second before she forced a too bright smile. Mark, I didn't know you'd be here this early. I stared at her. At him. At the way they were sitting just a little too close. Jake just took a slow sip of his coffee, completely unbothered. Like he wasn't sitting there with another man's wife. Like he didn't give a damn that he was about to be the center of the biggest scandal this town had ever seen. I walked toward them, slow and steady, the weight of every single set of eyes in the diner pressing against my back. Becky shifted in her seat, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear like she was trying to act normal. But the color in her face? The way her throat bobbed when she swallowed? She knew she was caught. I placed both hands on the edge of the table and leaned in slightly, keeping my voice calm. What's going on? Becky let out a nervous laugh. Oh, it's nothing. Jake and I were just Don't, I cut her off. Don't lie to me. Not here. Silence. And then Jake exhaled, bored, like this conversation was annoying him. It's been a couple of months, Mark, he said. Just like that. No hesitation. No guilt. Like he wasn't blowing up my marriage in the middle of breakfast. Becky closed her eyes for a second, like she wished he hadn't said it. A couple of months. Not days. Not weeks. Months. I let it settle in. Let the weight of it press against my ribs. Then, slowly I nodded. Well, I said, voice tight, at least you're honest. Becky reached for my hand, but I took a step back before she could touch me. Mark, please. I shook my head. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because if I didn't, I might put my fist through Jake's smug face. Instead, I turned to leave. The diner was so silent, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. But before I walked out, I looked at Jake one last time. And I smiled. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I don't even remember walking out of the diner. 1 second, I was standing there, staring down my wife and the man who had ruined my marriage, and the next, I was outside, breathing in the cold morning air like I had just escaped a burning building. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? My whole life had gone up in flames in the time it took Jake Henderson to sip his goddamn coffee. I stood there on the sidewalk, hands clenched into fists at my sides, my mind spinning. I could still hear the silence inside Millie's. The way the whole town had just watched it happen. How long had they known? How long had I been the last one to figure it out? A sharp buzz in my pocket pulled me back. My phone. I pulled it out with shaking hands, already knowing what I'd see. 3 missed calls. Campaign manager, 5 messages, 2 calls. Unknown number, voicemail. And then, a single text, sitting at the top of my screen. Becky, Mark, please don't do anything stupid. Can we talk? I stared at the message so long my vision blurred. Don't do anything stupid? She was sleeping with another man behind my back for months, and now she was worried about what I might do? I sucked in a slow breath, forcing the rage down. I couldn't afford to lose my head, not when I was already on the edge of losing everything else. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I walked to my truck, climbed inside, and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I needed to get out of here. Because if I went back inside that diner, I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep myself from breaking Jake Henderson's face in front of half the damn town. So I drove. Not home because home didn't feel like home anymore, but to the one place I could be alone. The lake was empty this early in the morning. No fishermen. No kids skipping rocks. Just me, standing at the edge of the dock, staring at the water like it had the answers I didn't. I pulled my phone out again. Opened Becky's text. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could ask her why. Why did she let me walk around town like a damn fool, smiling, shaking hands, talking about family values while she was sneaking around with another man? But I already knew there was no answer that would make it better. Instead, I just typed, meet me at the house. 1 hour. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. She would show up. Because if there was one conversation she couldn't avoid, it was this one. I got to the house first. The place Becky and I had built together, the place we had planned to raise a family in. I stood in the living room, looking around, realizing for the first time how many things in here were hers. The throw pillows. The scented candles. The framed photos on the walls. I picked up one of those photos, our wedding picture. Becky was in white, smiling at me like I was the only man in the world. What a joke. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made me set the picture down. Here we go. Becky walked in a few seconds later, looking nervous, like she wasn't sure if I was going to scream or start throwing things. Maybe she had a right to be worried. She opened her mouth, but I cut her off. No bullshit, Becky. Just tell me the truth. She swallowed, gripping the strap of her purse so hard her knuckles turned white. I never meant to hurt you, Mark. I laughed, shaking my head. That's what you start with? She blinked, caught off guard. No, really. I took a step closer. You're telling me that sneaking around behind my back with that asshole for months wasn't meant to hurt me? Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't plan this, but you did it anyway. Silence. Becky looked down. I was lonely, Mark. I let out a sharp breath, barely containing the rage bubbling under my skin. You were lonely? She flinched. You could have talked to me, I said, voice tight. You could have told me you were unhappy. But instead, I ran a hand through my hair, trying to hold it together. Jesus, Becky. Tears slipped down her cheeks now. I know I hurt you, she whispered. And I'll never forgive myself for that. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But she had spent months lying to my face. How the hell was I supposed to believe her now? I exhaled slowly, stepping back. I don't care what you feel anymore, Becky. I just want to know one thing. She wiped her face. What? I swallowed hard. Do you love him? Her breath hitched. And then, after a long, agonizing pause, she nodded. I didn't hear whatever she said next, because at that moment, everything went quiet. I was done. There was no saving this. No fixing it. Just ashes where my marriage used to be. I turned away, heading for the door. Mark, she called after me. Please, I stopped, gripping the door frame so tight my fingers ached. Then, without looking back, I said the only thing left to say. I hope he was worth it. And I walked out. Because this wasn't my home anymore. I don't remember much of the drive after I walked out that door. Just the sound of my tires on the road, the dull roar in my ears, and the way my knuckles turned white from gripping the wheel too damn hard. I wasn't sure where I was going, I just knew I couldn't stay there. I kept seeing her face. That little hesitation before she nodded. Do you love him? It played on a loop in my head, over and over, until I thought I was going to rip the steering wheel clean off. I didn't even know where I was until I pulled into the parking lot of a bar just outside town. Murphy's. A dive, the kind of place where people nursed their problems with cheap whiskey and kept their heads down. Exactly what I needed. The place was nearly empty this early in the afternoon. Just a few old-timers at the bar, a couple of guys playing pool in the back. The bartender barely glanced at me as I sat down, like he could smell the kind of day I was having. What'll it be? He asked, drying off a glass. Whiskey, I muttered. Double. He poured without a word, sliding the glass over. I didn't even hesitate, I knocked it back in one go, welcoming the burn. It didn't do much to dull the weight pressing down on my chest, but at least it was something. I was halfway through my second glass when someone slid onto the stool next to me. Didn't expect to see you here. I knew that voice. I turned, and there he was, Daniel Carter. Emily's husband. Or ex-husband now, I supposed. He looked like hell. His usually neat hair was unkempt, his shirt wrinkled. There were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. Maybe he hadn't. I sighed, turning back to my drink. Hell of a week, huh? Daniel let out a dry, humorless laugh. That's one way to put it. Silence stretched between us. Two men, sitting in the ruins of what used to be their lives. Finally, he spoke again. So, how'd you find out? I huffed a breath through my nose, shaking my head. Walked into the diner. Whole town already knew. Daniel let out a low whistle. Jesus. I took another sip. Ooh. He stared at his glass for a long moment before answering. Her dad told me. He let out a bitter chuckle. Guess he still had more respect for me than she did. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I had never thought much about Jake Henderson. He was just there. A nobody. A damn gym instructor who got lucky with the bored housewives of this town. I had never even considered him a threat. And now? Now he had my wife. Now he had Emily too. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I keep asking myself what I did wrong. I glanced at him. He shook his head. We had problems, sure. But I never thought she'd, His jaw clenched. I was working double shifts. Saving up to take her on a damn vacation. And the whole time, she was dashed. He exhaled sharply. I just don't get it. I stared at my drink, swirling the amber liquid in the glass. Yeah, me neither. Another silence. Daniel leaned back in his seat, stretching his jaw like he was trying to shake off the anger. Then, after a moment, he let out a short laugh. You know what the worst part is? I raised an eyebrow. He smirked, shaking his head. They won. I frowned. What do you mean? He gestured vaguely. Think about it. They get the excitement, the passion, the thrill of sneaking around. And now that they're caught? He huffed a bitter laugh. They don't have to hide anymore. They get to play happy couple while we sit here, looking like the assholes who weren't good enough. I hadn't thought about it like that. But now that I did, I felt sick. Because he was right. Becky and Jake were probably together right now. Maybe at his place, maybe still at the diner. Maybe curled up in bed, tangled in sheets, laughing about how dramatic I was being. And me? I was here. I clenched my jaw. Finished my drink in one long swallow. I don't know about you, I muttered, setting the empty glass down, but I'm not about to let them win. Daniel glanced at me, curious. Yeah? What are you gonna do? I stood, tossing a few bills on the counter. Not sure yet. I grabbed my jacket. But I'll figure it out. Because one thing was for damn sure. I wasn't about to sit back and let Jake walk away with my life. Not without a fight. I wasn't a vengeful man. At least, I never thought I was. But sitting there in that bar, listening to Daniel Carter tell me how we were the ones left picking up the pieces while they got to play happy couple, something in me snapped. I wasn't going to drink my way through this. I wasn't going to be the guy everyone in town pitied. I sure as hell wasn't going to let Becky and Jake move on like they hadn't just torn my entire world apart. I was going to do something about it. The next morning, I walked into my campaign office like nothing had happened. That was the key to small-town politics. You had to act like you were still in control, even when your life was a goddamn disaster. If you showed even the slightest weakness, people ate you alive. And I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. The second I stepped inside, though, I could feel the tension. My campaign manager, Lisa, was already waiting for me, arms crossed, a look of pure panic on her face. Jesus, what the hell happened? I walked past her, straight to the coffee pot, like we were talking about a minor inconvenience instead of the fact that my wife had been caught cheating on me in public. You'll have to be more specific. She let out a frustrated noise. Half the town is talking about Becky and Jake. The other half is talking about how you left Millie's looking like you were about to murder someone. She threw her hands up. And now Carter's team is milking this for all it's worth. I tensed. Carter? She nodded. His campaign put out a statement this morning. Something about how a mayor should lead by example in his personal life. I set my coffee down a little too hard. That bastard. Ronald Carter was my biggest rival in this election. A smug, self-righteous opportunist who had been waiting for me to slip up. And now, thanks to Becky, I had handed him the perfect weapon. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay calm. What are people saying? Lisa sighed. Some think you should drop out of the race. Others feel sorry for you. She hesitated. A few are questioning why Becky cheated. I stiffened. What? She looked uncomfortable. People are talking, Mark. You know how this town works. They're saying maybe you weren't giving her enough attention. That maybe she dashed. I slammed my fist against the desk, cutting her off. She flinched but didn't back down. I'm just telling you what's being said. My jaw clenched so hard it ached. I had given Becky everything. A home. A life. My loyalty. And now, not only had she betrayed me, but people were acting like it was somehow my fault? I took a deep breath. Forced my expression back to neutral. Schedule a press conference? Lisa blinked. What? You heard me. I'm not letting Carter turn this into a campaign strategy. I grabbed my jacket. If the town wants to talk, I'll give them something to talk about. Lisa hesitated. Are you sure that's a good idea? I met her gaze, steady. This town loves a good scandal, I said. Let's see how they handle a real one. By noon, the entire town was watching. The press conference was held in front of Town Hall. News cameras. Reporters. Hell, even people from the diner had shown up, like this was some kind of live reality show. And right in the middle of the crowd? She stood near the back, arms crossed, looking nervous. Jake wasn't with her. Maybe he had enough sense to stay the hell away. I stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. The crowd quieted. Then, with the entire town watching, I spoke. I know there's been a lot of talk about my personal life these past few days. My voice was calm, steady. And I'll be the first to admit, I never thought I'd be standing here, addressing something so private in a public forum. A murmur ran through the crowd. People were hanging on to my every word. But since certain opportunists dash, I let my gaze drift to where Carter's people stood. Have decided to turn this into a political matter. Let me set the record straight. I exhaled slowly. My wife had an affair. Guess. Whispers. People shifting uncomfortably. I kept going. For months, Becky was seeing someone else behind my back. And while I never imagined I'd be in this position, I want to make one thing clear: this does not define me. I straightened. I have spent my entire career fighting for this town, building trust, working to make sure we all have a better future. That hasn't changed. My gaze swept across the crowd. You want to judge me for something I had no control over? Fine. But don't you dare let a man like Ronald Carter use this to manipulate you. Carter stiffened in the back, but I didn't stop. If he wants to win this race, he should do it the right way. Not by kicking a man when he's down. Silence. Then, from the back, applause. It started small, hesitant, then grew. And just like that, I had them. The press conference ended a few minutes later. Reporters shouted questions, but I didn't answer. I had said what I needed to say. But as I stepped away from the podium, I felt her eyes on me. She pushed through the crowd, stepping into my path. Mark, can we dash? No. Her face fell. Please. Just for a minute. I stared at her. The woman I had loved. The woman who had thrown everything away for a fling with a gym instructor. Then finally I spoke. You don't get to ask for my time anymore, Becky. I walked past her, leaving her standing there in the middle of the crowd. Because whatever we had, it was over. For good. The thing about small towns is that people pretend to forgive, but they never really forget. It had been 3 days since my press conference, and the town was still buzzing. Some people called me a class act for handling it with dignity. Others thought I was a fool for addressing it at all. But the most annoying ones? The ones who acted like I had done something wrong. Becky had played the poor, neglected wife card so well that some people actually believed it. Marriage takes two, you know. Maybe if Mark had paid more attention to her, she wouldn't have strayed if she was happy at home. Like it was my fault she was sneaking around with Jake Henderson for months. I was in no mood to hear it. So when I walked into Murphy's bar that night, I wasn't looking for company. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I just wanted a drink strong enough to burn through the mess Becky had left behind. But the second I stepped inside, I spotted him. Sitting at the bar, beer in hand, looking relaxed. Smooth. Like he hadn't just blown up my life. I stopped cold. The place went quiet. A few guys near the pool table exchanged glances, probably wondering if they were about to see a bar fight. Jake must have felt me staring because he turned, locking eyes with me. And then, the bastard had the nerve to smirk. Something inside me snapped. I didn't think. Didn't hesitate. I was across the bar before I even registered moving, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him off the stool. His beer crashed to the floor, the sound echoing through the silence. Someone gasped. A chair scraped back. But I didn't care. Say it, I snarled, shoving him back against the bar. Jake's smirk faltered. Say what? Say whatever the hell you just thought was so funny. My grip tightened on his shirt. Come on, Henderson. You had the balls to screw my wife. Let's hear what else you've got to say. His jaw clenched. Look, man dash. I shoved him harder. Don't look, man me. You knew exactly what you were doing. My voice was low, lethal. You knew, and you didn't care. So tell me, Jake, was it worth it? A muscle in his jaw twitched. He didn't answer. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right? You can screw another man's wife, but you can't even look him in the eye after? I let go of him abruptly, stepping back. Pathetic. He straightened his shirt, glaring. I didn't steal her, Mark. His voice was quiet but sharp. She came to me. That nearly broke me. It took every ounce of restraint not to put my fist through his face right then and there. Instead, I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. You know what, Jake? I forced a smile, something cold and sharp. You did me a favor. He frowned. What? I leaned in slightly. You think you won, don't you? You think Becky picked you? I laughed, shaking my head. But let me tell you something about Becky Simmons. I met his gaze dead on, making sure he was really listening. She's never satisfied. Ever. She got bored with me, and she'll get bored with you. I took a step back. Enjoy your temporary victory, Henderson. Because one day, she'll do to you what she did to me. I turned and walked out, leaving him standing there. But before I stepped outside, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror behind the bar. Jake, standing rigid, jaw clenched. Because deep down, he knew I was right. The air outside was cold, but it did nothing to cool the fire in my chest. My hands were still clenched into fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed to get out of here. I had already spent too much energy on Becky and Jake. They weren't my problem anymore. I was about to get in my truck when I heard a voice behind me. You okay? I turned. My campaign manager. She was standing near the curb, arms crossed, studying me with something between concern and curiosity. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. What are you doing here? She smirked. I had a feeling you'd come looking for trouble. I let out a breath. Trouble found me first? She raised an eyebrow. You hit him? Almost. Damn. She clicked her tongue. Would have been fun to watch. I huffed a laugh. I'll keep that in mind next time. She hesitated, then took a step closer. Look, Mark. I know you're pissed. You have every right to be. But don't let this thing consume you. I frowned. You think I should just let it go? Lisa shrugged. I think you should win. I blinked. What? She smirked. Ronald Carter is running his mouth about how you're too emotional to lead. You want to get back at Becky? At Jake? Win the damn election. Show everyone that you're still standing. I stared at her, something clicking in my mind. She was right. Becky had taken my marriage. Jake had taken my pride. But they weren't going to take my future. I exhaled slowly, feeling something I hadn't felt in days. Purpose. I turned to Lisa, nodding. All right. My voice was steady. Let's win this damn thing. And just like that, the scandal wasn't my weakness anymore. It was my fuel. Next morning, I walked into my campaign office like a man on a mission. Lisa was already there, flipping through a stack of papers, but when she saw me, she raised an eyebrow. "You look like hell." "Good," I muttered. "Now let's get to work." She smirked. "Now there's the Mark Simmons I know." We spent the next few hours strategizing. If Carter was going to turn my personal life into a political weakness, I'd turn it into my greatest weapon. Lisa had been right. People love a good redemption arc. If I could convince the town that I was the guy who got knocked down but got back up stronger, I'd have a fighting chance. And the best part? Carter was too cocky to see it coming. That afternoon, I went straight to work. First, I hit up the radio station, knowing damn well half the town listened to morning talk shows while driving to work. "Everyone knows what happened," I said, keeping my voice steady. I won't pretend it didn't. But I refused to let my personal pain distract me from the real issues in this town. Next, I hit Main Street. I shook hands, smiled, looked people in the eye. I made sure they saw me standing tall, not hiding, not avoiding, just moving forward. And just like that, the narrative changed. I wasn't the poor guy who got cheated on. I was the fighter who refused to let it break him. And people? They ate it up. Even the ones who had whispered maybe he wasn't giving Becky enough attention started saying, "Damn, Mark's handling this well." That's the thing about small towns, they love a comeback. But not everyone was happy about my newfound momentum. I was at the grocery store when I ran into her. She was standing near the produce aisle, picking through a pile of apples like she wasn't the most talked about woman in town. She looked up just as I reached for a bag of coffee, and for a second, neither of us moved. Then she sighed. "Mark?" I nodded. "Becky?" She glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Can we talk?" I let out a sharp breath. "About what?" Her eyes flicked down, like she wasn't sure where to start. I didn't expect you to go so public about it." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You didn't expect me to fight back?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not what I meant." I leaned against the cart, studying her. "Then what did you mean, Becky?" She hesitated. "Then I didn't want to hurt you, Mark." I stared at her for a long second. Then I shook my head, laughing under my breath. "That's funny," I said, voice calm. "Because you sure as hell didn't seem too concerned about that while you were sneaking around with Jake." Her face twisted in something like guilt. "It wasn't like that." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? Then tell me, Becky. What was it like?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked down. "Exactly." I grabbed the coffee and turned to leave. But before I walked away, I said one last thing. "You made your choice, Becky." I met her gaze, steady. "Now live with it." And I left her standing there. That night, I got a text. Not from Becky. Not from Lisa. From Daniel Carter. "Daniel, Murphy's? You in?" I stared at the message for a second. Then I grabbed my keys. Because if there was one guy in this town who really understood what I was going through, it was him. Murphy's bar was quieter than usual when I walked in that night. Maybe it was because it was a weeknight, or maybe it was because people knew that both of us, Daniel Carter and I, were about to be in the same damn room. And in a town like ours, that was better than live TV. I spotted him in the back, already nursing a whiskey. He didn't look up when I sat down across from him, just slid a second glass in my direction. I took it without a word, knocking back half of it in one go. It burned, but that was the point. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, two men who had been publicly humiliated by the same damn people. Finally, Daniel sighed. "So, how's your week been?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, just found out my wife was screwing another man. Got publicly humiliated. Had half the town whispering about what I must have done to deserve it." I took another sip. "Then I turned it into a campaign strategy." Daniel snorted. "Now that's a power move." "Damn right it is." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Emily called me." I tensed slightly. "Yeah." He nodded. "Wants to talk?" He made air quotes with his fingers. Didn't say what about, but I can guess. I leaned back in my chair. "You gonna let her?" He let out a low chuckle. "Hell no." I smirked. "Good." Another pause. Then, Daniel leaned in slightly. "You ever wonder if they're happy?" I didn't have to ask who they were. Becky and Jake. Emily and whoever the hell she was with now. I exhaled slowly, staring down at my glass. I used to. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And now? I looked up, meeting his gaze. Now, I don't give a damn. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I realized it was true. Because Becky? She wasn't my problem anymore. The next morning, I woke up with a dull headache and a clearer mind than I'd had in weeks. I wasn't just moving on, I was winning. The election was 2 weeks away, and Carter's attacks on me were losing steam. People were talking not about Becky, not about Jake, but about me. About how I was handling this like a leader. About how I wasn't letting this town bury me. And Carter? He was nervous. I saw it in the way his campaign started scrambling, trying to find new angles of attack. But the thing was, I wasn't weak anymore. I had already lost the most important thing in my life. And that made me dangerous. One afternoon, as I was leaving my office, I spotted Becky standing by my truck. I almost kept walking. Almost ignored her completely. But then she turned, and for the first time since this whole thing blew up, she didn't look angry or defensive. She just looked lost. I sighed. "What do you want, Becky?" She swallowed, arms wrapped around herself. "I don't know." I laughed, shaking my head. "That makes 2 of us." She looked down at the pavement. "I didn't think it would be like this." I studied her for a long moment. "Like what?" She hesitated. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "I didn't think I'd miss you." That hit me like a punch to the ribs. Not because I still loved her, but because, for the first time, I saw it. Regret. I inhaled slowly, letting the weight of it settle. Then, finally, I shook my head. "You made your choice, Becky." And this time, when I walked away, I didn't look back. I thought Becky showing up outside my office would be the final moment between us, the last time I'd have to see her, talk to her, deal with the mess she made. I was wrong. Because 2 days later, she showed up again. This time, she wasn't waiting outside like some lost little girl. This time, she was standing in my driveway when I got home, arms crossed, eyes locked on me like she had something to say. And judging by the look on her face, I wasn't gonna like it. I sighed, stepping out of my truck. "Becky, what the hell do you want?" She hesitated. Then I think I made a mistake. I froze. For a second, I thought I hadn't heard her right. That maybe my brain just refused to process the insanity of what she just said. Then I let out a sharp breath, shaking my head. "Unbelievable. Mark, please No." I held up a hand. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to stand here and act like this was some bad decision you made on a whim." Her jaw tightened. "It wasn't like that, Then what the hell was it like, Becky?" My voice was rising now, but I didn't care. Because from where I'm standing, it looked a hell of a lot like you throwing away our entire marriage for some pathetic, secret thrill. Her face crumpled slightly, but I wasn't done. "You didn't just cheat, Becky. You lied. For months. You let me sleep beside you, talk about our future, and you knew you were sneaking around with him." I exhaled sharply. "And now what? You regret it?" She swallowed hard. I laughed, shaking my head. "But because the excitement's over? Because you got what you wanted, and it wasn't enough?" I took a step closer, voice deadly calm. "Or is it because you finally realized that while you were off playing games with Jake Henderson, I was out here actually moving on?" Her eyes flickered with something. Guilt? Pain? I didn't know. Didn't care. She opened her mouth, but before she could say another word, a car pulled up at the end of my driveway. We both turned. And there, sitting behind the wheel of his cheap-ass truck, was Jake. Becky's face went pale. My stomach twisted. Not in anger, not even in pain. Just in disgust. Because of course, she had come here while he was waiting in the car. I let out a slow, bitter laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. Mark Get the hell out of my driveway, Becky." She flinched. I pointed to the truck, where Jake was watching us like some pathetic bystander to his own train wreck of a relationship. "Go on. Your backup plan is waiting." Her lips parted like she wanted to argue. But she didn't. Because she knew. She had burned the bridge, and I wasn't about to rebuild it for her. She turned slowly, walking toward the truck, and I watched as she climbed into the passenger seat without another word. Jake hesitated for half a second like he was debating whether he should say something to me. Then he put the truck in reverse and drove away. I stood there for a long time after they were gone, staring at the empty road, my breath still heavy. And then, finally, I felt free. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, I didn't feel like I had lost anything. I felt like I had dodged a bullet. The best thing about rock bottom is that once you hit it, there's nowhere left to go but up. Becky showing up in my driveway should have been a setback. It should have reopened wounds, dragged me back into that dark hole where I spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what I did wrong. But it didn't. Because as I watched her drive away with Jake, something clicked. I wasn't losing. I was winning. The election was 1 week away, and Carter's campaign was desperate. After my press conference, after I turned the scandal into my own damn PR move, his team scrambled to find another way to hit me. But here's the thing, a man with nothing to lose is impossible to take down. And Carter? He didn't have the guts to go toe-to-toe with me. I could see it in his eyes at the town hall debate. He threw the usual weak punches, hinted at stability and trust in leadership. But every time he tried to use my marriage as ammo, it backfired. Because people saw through it. They saw a man who got knocked down and got back up stronger. They saw a man who didn't hide, didn't whine, didn't crumble. They saw a man who was still standing. And Ronald Carter? He saw a man who was about to beat him. The night before the election, I went back to Murphy's. Not because I was drowning my sorrows, but because Daniel Carter had texted me again. Daniel, one more round? You know, for old time's sake? I smirked. It was strange, really. This whole mess had taken so much from both of us. But somehow, through all of it, we'd become something close to friends. So I sat across from him, sipping whiskey, watching as he turned his glass in his hands. She texted me again, he said after a while. I didn't need to ask who. And? He shrugged. Didn't answer. I nodded. Good. He smirked. What about you? Becky still sniffing around? I huffed a laugh. Not after the last time. Daniel leaned back, shaking his head. You ever think about it? How we got here? I took a slow sip of my drink. Yeah. And? I looked at him. I think we dodged a bullet. He considered that for a moment. Then he grinned, raising his glass. To survival? I smirked, clinking my glass against his. To survival? The next day, I walked into town hall, head held high, ready to face whatever the election had in store for me. Because I wasn't just Mark Simmons, the man who got cheated on. I was Mark Simmons, the man who didn't break. And I wasn't going down without a fight. The votes were counted by midnight. I won. It wasn't a landslide, but it was enough. Enough to prove that I wasn't just some scandal people whispered about in diners. Enough to show Carter that he bet on the wrong downfall. Enough to prove to myself that I had come out of this not just alive, but stronger. I stood in front of town hall, looking out at the people who had believed in me. Cheated on man or not, they'd voted for me. Trusted me. And Carter? He was nowhere to be seen. Lisa stood beside me, arms crossed, smirking. Told you? I let out a breath, shaking my head. Damn right you did. The town had given me their answer. I wasn't a victim. I was their leader. The next morning, I woke up to one last text from Becky. Becky, congratulations, Mark. You deserve this. I stared at it for a second. Then I deleted it. Because I didn't need her validation. Not anymore. 2 weeks later, I walked into Murphy's, and there he was, Daniel Carter. Same spot, same whiskey, same knowing smirk. So, Mr. Mayor, he said, raising his glass. How's it feel? I sat down across from him, signaling to the bartender for a drink. It feels, I said, like I finally won. And for the first time in a long, long time. I actually meant it. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.